Sejam todos muito bem-vindos. Eu sou Roberta Arinelli, diretora médica da Origin Health e editora-executiva da MIT Technology Review Brasil. Agora eu tenho o prazer de falar com o Dr. Cyrus Cooper, presidente da International Osteoporose Foundation. Dr. Cyrus, muito obrigada pela sua participação. Como você poderia descrever o impacto da osteoporose para a sociedade em relação à qualidade de vida, questões clínicas e questões econômicas?
We now know that osteoporosis constitutes a major public health burden in terms of its relationship with fracture. These fractures typically occur at the hip, vertebral body, and distal forearm, but arise at a host of other skeletal sites that are also associated with low bone density. The lifetime risk from age 50 onwards is around 50% among women and 20% among men. And the typical sites have a cumulative lifetime risk of 14% for the hip in women, 11% for clinically diagnosed vertebral fractures, and 13% for the wrist, with comparable rates in men of 3%, 4%, and 2%. Almost all hip fractures are hospitalized and they're associated with excess mortality of around 20%. Around 1% to 2% of vertebral fractures are hospitalized, and they are also associated with excess mortality, but in this instance, not because of the trauma and surgical intervention arising from the fracture, but because of comorbidities, which independently predispose to osteoporosis and early mortality. For all sites combined in the European Union, there are around 3.5 million fractures each year, and they cost around 40 billion euros. This is likely to increase over the next decade, with a 29.6% increase among women and a 42.6% increase among men, so that the annual number of fractures by 2034 will have reached 5.3 million, and that represents an over 25% increase. The hip, vertebrae, and forearm will remain the major sites of osteoporosis-related fractures, but fractures at other sites will account for around 45 to 50% of all osteoporosis-related fractures. Osteoporosis is defined as low bone density below a T-score of -2.5 using DXA. And by this definition, around 25.5 million women and 6.5 million men in the European Union suffer osteoporosis, for a prevalence in women of 22% above age 50 and in men of 6.6% above age 50.
A osteoporose ainda não é uma prioridade de saúde no Brasil, apesar das estimativas de que até 2050, 30% da população do país vai ter mais de 60 anos. Qual seria o atendimento ideal para pacientes com osteoporose em geral e também para os pacientes com osteoporose de alto risco?
The International Osteoporosis Foundation has published guidelines for the management of osteoporosis, which include the assessment of baseline risk factors, their integration with DXA into a 10-year risk of major osteoporotic fractures. This 10-year risk is then related to age to determine a treatment threshold. And different countries in Europe have different willingness to pay for treatment. But these treatment thresholds rise with age up to around age 70 and plateau thereafter. And typically, oral bisphosphonate therapy comprises the mainstay of treatment, with progression to intravenous bisphosphonates or denosumab, should there be any failure to tolerate or other complication with the use of oral bisphosphonates. Raloxifene and menopausal hormone therapy retain a role, as of course do the recently developed anabolics, including teriparatide, abaloparatide, and romosozumab. increasing attention has been paid to the very high risk of fracture, typically occurring within the first year or 2 years after a low trauma fracture. This very high or imminent risk has led to attempts to define it using FRAX or using routinely derived hospital episode statistics, as for example has been undertaken in both the United Kingdom and in the European Union and in North America. Broadly speaking, if an individual has a major osteoporotic fracture risk of 30% or above, and a recent fracture in the spine or hip in the last year, they are likely to meet these criteria for very high risk. And in these circumstances, intervention with anabolic therapy, teriparatide biosimilars, abaloparatide, or romosozumab are all recommended before switching after 1 to 2 years to an anti-resorptive regimen, whether it be bisphosphonates or denosumab.
A International Osteoporose Foundation publicou apelo urgente com 10 pontos de call to action sobre ações baseadas em evidências para garantir o acesso ao melhor tratamento da osteoporose. Quais são esses pontos? Eles podem ser replicados para qualquer sistema de saúde?
The recommendations of the International Osteoporosis Foundation to close the treatment gap include case finding and management, public awareness, and government and health system issues. For case finding and management, there is a focus on secondary fracture prevention, that is, the identification of individuals who've had a previous fracture and their assessment for osteoporosis and intervention where appropriate. This is epitomized best by the Capture the Fracture campaign that has been run at IOF for the last decade and which is available in full in its website. We have a number of assessment characteristics for a fracture liaison service, and we have a number of key performance indicators, as well as a host of mentorship and educational opportunities for learning how to develop an effective secondary fracture prevention system. The next component of case finding and management is secondary osteoporosis. This entails identification of risk factors that predispose to bone loss, for example, glucocorticoid therapy, and the instatement of preventive measures for these. And the last of the 3 in case finding and management is primary fracture prevention in those at highest risk. This utilizes the MRC SCOOP trial that was published in The Lancet, in which 12,500 women aged 70 to 85 years were randomized to usual care or FRAX-based treatment targeting, and the screened and treated group had a 28% reduction in the risk of hip fracture over 5 years. This has been replicated in studies in Scandinavia and in the Netherlands, and increasing attention is turning to the instatement of primary fracture prevention among those at highest risk. The next category to reduce the treatment gap is public awareness, and there's an importance of treatment adherence that needs to be pointed out, and awareness of the benefit-risk balance of treatment, with risks, for example, atypical femoral fracture or osteonecrosis of the jaw being really quite infrequent when compared with the number of fractures saved when on bisphosphonate or denosumab therapy. And the last category to reduce treatment gaps is government and health system issues. Here we include access to reimbursement for osteoporosis assessment and treatment, and the prioritization of fracture prevention in national policy. And this again is an area in which the Capture the Fracture initiative and the IOF had made great strides in the last 2 decades.
Como a inclusão do romosozumab pelo NICE contribuiu para o tratamento da osteoporose no Reino Unido?
The availability of romosozumab, as well as teriparatide and the teriparatide biosimilars, permits treatment early with anabolic therapy among those at the highest risk with very high or imminent risk. As I indicated earlier, These are individuals who have had a previous fracture within the last year and who are likely to have had a major osteoporotic fracture risk of around 30% over 10 years by FRAX, and who will benefit from instatement of early romosozumab with subsequent anti-resorptive therapy.
Tratar a osteoporose como uma prioridade pelos governos e profissionais de saúde, incluindo a criação de um plano de ação nacional com objetivos claros, é essencial para o cuidado ideal da osteoporose. Você deixaria alguma mensagem para o Brasil como um país que ainda carece dessas políticas?
It is really important when dealing with osteoporosis that the government places a priority on fracture risk reduction and that healthcare providers prioritize reimbursement for risk assessment and treatment strategies. A national action plan of the sort that we have in the United Kingdom with the National Osteoporosis Guideline Group, or of the sort we have in Europe with the International Osteoporosis Foundation and European Society guidelines for the treatment of osteoporosis, provides a wonderful backdrop against which such reimbursement and policy initiatives can be maintained. It's really important that Brazil creates such a national action plan and that this is then activated in order that the burden of fractures is reduced in our ever-aging population.
Dr. Cyrus, muito obrigada por sua participação. Foi um grande prazer e uma honra.
Thank you very much indeed.